Students, a very good morning to all of you. Students, a few days ago I shared the text of the novel that is there in our syllabus in paper 4, the novel written by Jane Austen entitled Mansfield Park. Students, I hope you have started reading this novel. Before discussing the novel, let us briefly come to know about the life of this famous British novelist Jane Austen. Students, Jane Austen was born on 16th December 1775 in Steventon, where her father held a post as a rector. Jane lived in the family's small parish house for first 25 years of her life. Here she led a quiet but pleasant existence, spending time at home or visiting with local families of similar social status. She attended parties and dances at many of the local grand houses, including the Van, that is now owned by the British National Trust, a registered charity founded in the year 1895 to preserve places of historic interest. Students, Jane also visited with her siblings in the adjoining counties and Kent in particular, and Kent became one of Jane's favorite places. Although she did not write any of the 6 novels during these years, much of the juvenilia, including her satirical The History of England, was composed during this period. Students, Bath, where Jane's family moved after her father's retirement in the year 1801, provided Austen with a different view of 19th century social customs. Although her family's social standing did not enable her to travel in the most elite circles, she was a frequent visitor to assembly room events and made regular trips to the pump room, another of city's center of social life. Students, Bath serves as the locale for scenes in 2 novels entitled Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, and both draw heavily on her experiences there. Jane apparently used her time in Bath primarily to gather material for future novels or to infuse into revisions of her previous ones. She did not begin any of her 6 novels during the 5 years that she lived in Bath. Students, although Jane's travel experiences never took her out of the immediate area, she traveled quite a bit within the south of England. During the years they lived in Bath, she and her family often spent intervals of time at the seaside, most often the beaches on the Darwin and Dorset coasts. These locales worked their way into her writing, as did most others with whom Jane came into contact. Persuasion, in particular, contains scenes based directly on her experience in the small fishing village of Lamb Regis, which she uses as the scene of Louisa Musgrove's frightening fall. Students, after her father's death in January 1805, Jane Austen, her mother, her sister Cassandra, and family friend Martha Lloyd moved first to Clifton and then in the autumn of 1806 to Southampton, where they remained for several years. In the year 1809, they took up a residence at Shorten House, a small cottage on the property of her brother Richard's estate. If we visit the house today, we can still see the tiny tripod table in the dining room where she revised her first 3 novels, Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, and Pride and Prejudice, and composed the remaining 3, Mansfield Park, that she started writing in the February of 1811 and finished it in the month of June in the year 1813. Emma, that Jane Austen started in January 1804 and that was finished in the March 1815, and Persuasion, that Jane Austen started writing in the August 1815 and she finished this novel in the August 1816. Students, while at Charlton, Jane and her family lived in relative solitude. They relied mostly on another for company rather than seeking out society in local families as they had done while at Steventon. Jane's niece Caroline remarked that they were on friendly but rather distant terms with all. Jane's brother often visited the women at Charlton, Henry from London, James from Steventon, where he had taken over his father's post as a rector, Francis and Charles from their ships when they were on leave, and Edward from his house at Godmersham. Students, Jane lived at Charlton until her declining health made it necessary for her and Cassandra to move to Winchester, where she could be closer to expert medical care. She, Cassandra, and Martha Lloyd made the trip in May of 1817. Her condition left her in a continually degenerative state of health. Jane continued to write during this period. However, Sanditon, the novel she was working on until her death, is a self-mocking treatment of the invalid state into which she could not prevent herself from slipping. Students, Jane Austen died on 18th July 1817 in the arms of her beloved sister Cassandra. She is buried in the north aisle of Winchester Cathedral and only a simple plaque identifies her grave. Strangely, the stone makes no mention of the fact that Jane Austen was a novelist other than oblique reference to the extraordinary endowment of her mind. But despite this modest resting place, Jane Austen has been immortalized by the body of work that survived her and continued to delight and entertain readers today, almost 200 years after her death. Students, Jane Austen's England saw significant changes in social, political, and economic life. At the time of her birth, England was embroiled in a bitter struggle with its American colonies, the loss of which several years later proved to be a tremendous blow to English political and military prestige. Under the rule of George III, England's political climate became increasingly unstable, with constant struggles between king and Whig politicians. Across the Channel, the French Revolution had begun, and the English aristocracy watched in horror as royal heads began to rule. Between 1804 and 1814, the period in which Austen did most of her writing, England was consumed by a fight against the power-hungry Napoleon. Students, although Austen was undoubtedly aware of these external events, they remain notably absent from her writings. She made it a point to write about only what she knew from first-hand experience, and having never left the south of England, her experience was rather limited. Jane Austen's novels are, in this sense, highly autobiographical. Her characters share this insular view of their world, carrying on with dances and amateur theatricals seemingly oblivious to any outside concern. Students, this much for today. We will continue the discussion on Mansfield Park in our later classes. Thank you very much.